Welcome to your essential business briefing. I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up, the pandemic sparked a revolution in social protection, but is the safety net stronger after Covid-19? The head of the International Labour Organization joins us with details of their latest research. As governments in many countries lift Covid-19 restrictions and wind down financial aid, we'll give you a health checkup for the global economy. Plus, as the European Central Bank ponders a digital euro, our correspondents report from Beijing on how the digital yuan has gone down with Chinese shoppers and businesses. The past 18 months have seen governments pour trillions of euros into beefing up social protections like furlough schemes, unemployment payments and sick pay. But those benefits haven't been offered everywhere. A new report from the International Labour Organization has found that in 2020, only a third of working-age people globally have legal income protection during illness, and less than a fifth of those out of work receive unemployment benefits. Let's speak now to Guy Ryder, who's the Director General of the International Labour Organization. Guy, thanks for being with us. Can you talk first to us about what happened to social protection during the pandemic? Did governments step up to meet the needs of workers during that time?
I think we can say that unprecedented efforts were made as COVID-19 struck different countries. We saw an explosive growth in ad hoc measures to protect people from very extreme situations. We've been able to record some 1,700 individual initiatives taken by government to protect people. In the G20 countries alone last year, some 64 million people were reached by these ad hoc measures. But I think there's two things to think about there. One is these ad hoc temporary measures are in themselves, I think, an illustration of the pre-existing gaps and inadequacies of the system. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been necessary. And secondly, what happens now? As the world begins to think about coming out of the pandemic and as the types of financial support that has been made available may be reduced. What happens next? Do we simply go back to where we were before, or do we try and do something a little bit better than that?
Well, that's exactly where I want to take you next. What is your message now to governments who are trying to strike that difficult balance coming out of a pandemic to ensure that people are protected, but also to get their budget in order?
Well, right, we're arguing in our report for taking the high road. There are two options here, put simplistically. Either we can revert, as I've said, to the pre-existing status quo, take the low road and go back to all of the inadequacies and gaps of the past. We do not think that is the right thing to do. We rather think there is a need to take the high road, that is to start to invest and to cooperate together to make good the glaring gaps in a situation today where it's only a minority of workers in the world who have any social protection whatsoever, only a minority. Now, we understand, we're not unrealistic about this, that governments are facing very important constraints on public expenditure, competing priorities, vaccination finance, climate finance, but social protection has to stand up there as a priority amongst the priorities. I think if we're learning anything from COVID-19 and the experience of the last 18 months, is that we simply have to be better prepared. If we're serious about resilience in our societies, I think social protection stands almost as a definition of resilience for when the next crisis strikes, and it will.
What are the good examples then from this crisis? What sort of measures can you give us examples of that governments should be prioritising, putting funding behind?
Yeah, well, one thing to say is a temporary measure, an emergency measure, is not necessarily the template for permanent solutions, permanent systemic approaches to social protection. And what we want to see, and we've always argued for this, is that in the first instance, all countries, and we're talking about countries at all levels of development, need as a minimum to put in place social protection floors. These minimum systems that provide the basic security that all human beings need. And here's an interesting phenomenon. It's not only that the rich countries spend more in absolute terms on social protection, they do in relative terms as well. In average, countries spend about 9% of their national income on social protection. Rich countries spend much more than that. It's up in the 15, 16% range. The least developed countries spend 1.1%. So we need to start investing in areas which are sort of deserts of social protection and put in place these social protection floors. Now, some of the initiatives taken during the pandemic are instructive. We've seen conditional cash benefits put in place. We've been seeing income support. I think some of these can be extrapolated, can be maintained, can be systematized on a more permanent basis. There are other things which are clearly specific to the crisis and will be withdrawn. I'm thinking of some of the furlough schemes, some of the income support schemes that's gone with technical unemployment schemes. So we really have to make the difference between the two, but learn from what we've done and what we've seen during the pandemic.
Who should pay for this? Should workers be contributing more to provide those social protections for everyone?
But I think most schemes, and I think this is the lesson from 100 years of experience of building social protection schemes, combine contributory systems. They're very familiar to many of us in Europe, whereby employers and the employee contribute on a payroll basis to their own social protection in the future. So these contributory insurance schemes, but they won't be enough. They certainly won't be enough in countries where you have very high levels of informality, where this type of scheme is difficult to operate. So you need basic tax-based, budget-based social assistance schemes, and gradually you have to combine the two. But in so combining, you've got to do two things. You've got to ensure financial sustainability, of course, and then you have also to ensure that both coverage and the adequacy of the benefits are sufficient to achieve the goals that we are pursuing. There are many, unfortunately, many schemes in the world which are not comprehensive in terms of coverage. Informal sector workers, the self-employed, in a different register, gig employees are often left out of systems. And on the other hand, the level of benefits which are provided are simply inadequate to meeting even the most basic needs of the people concerned.
Okay, Guy Ryder from the International Labour Organization, thank you very much for speaking to us. Now, the United States is the only economy in the G7 to have already recovered to its pre-pandemic level. That's according to figures from the Paris-based Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. After the worst recession in nearly a century, many countries are now easing COVID-19 restrictions and winding down financial aid. Cole Stangler is here with more on this now. Cole, what state are the world's major economies in now, 18 months into the pandemic?
Well, overall, they are improving, but they're still not at the levels that they were at before the COVID crisis. Despite the recovery, the OECD says that the Eurozone economy is still 3% smaller than it was in late 2019. It's a similar story for France, as you can see there. Now, as you mentioned, the U.S. is the exception when it comes to G7 states. The American economy is nearly 1% bigger than it was pre-COVID. Now, outside of the G7, China has also seen growth since the outbreak of COVID. The world's second largest economy, expected to grow around 6% this year. That's basically the same rate that it was at before the pandemic.
So what's the outlook then for the next few months?
Well, it's fairly positive. Many advanced economies, including France, are expected to return to pre-COVID levels by the end of the year. The IMF, for its part, projects the world economy will grow by 6% this year and then 5% over next year. Now, the fund does say the recovery is basically split into two blocks: advanced economies opening up, and then others that are facing surges in the virus and rising death tolls. A big reason for this divide is vaccine access. So broadly speaking, wealthier countries have access to shots, poorer countries do not. Then, of course, there's still a degree of uncertainty basically everywhere tied to the unpredictability of this virus.
So what sort of challenges are major economies facing now?
Well, there are a lot, but a big one is the withdrawal of state aid now that you have economies that are reopening. It's an issue that we're seeing play out here in France, where the state's phasing out subsidies for businesses. There's also concern about inflation. For instance, the Eurozone just recorded its highest monthly increase in prices in a decade. Now, it's a source of debate just how temporary or not this uptick is, but ultimately that is an issue that it could encourage central banks to potentially hike borrowing costs. Now, on top of that, the COVID crisis has seen an increase in inequalities, with women and younger people more at risk of losing their jobs. You also have the question of the inequality that exists between richer and poorer nations too, and their different paces of recovery.
Cole Stangler, thank you. China last year became the first major economy to introduce a digital currency backed by its central bank. The goal was to help a crackdown on the likes of Bitcoin. It's an idea being considered elsewhere too, including by the European Central Bank. Our correspondents Anna Hartley and Charles Pellegrin report now on the Chinese experience of the digital yuan.
China has a long history of financial innovation. Over 1,000 years ago, Song dynasty rulers pioneered the use of paper money. Now it's leading the world again, introducing the first major central bank-backed digital currency. To promote the rollout, the city of Beijing gave away 100,000 wallets containing 200 digital yuan each for people to spend with a dedicated app. But its popularity has been short-lived.
Many people used up the money in their account during the pilot period, and then they stopped.
Making the digital yuan a success is a high priority for the government.
A very small percentage of people have credit score in China. That is something the government tried to establish is a wider or a clear picture of individual credit data.
For now, this data lies almost entirely in the hands of fintech companies. But with a population already accustomed to digital payments, the government has few ways to attract users to its system.
If you use digital yuan, the government promised to protect your privacy, but whether or not Chinese consumers will buy into that narrative, it's questionable, right? Do you want the private players to have your data or the government? I don't know.
Meanwhile, China continues efforts to stamp out Bitcoin mining and trading. The energy-intensive activity clashes with the government's environmental goals, as well as their desire to get a firm grip on the digital currency market.
That's it from us for now, but you can watch back all of our previous shows on the France 24 website. Plus, we're on social media if you want to get in touch with your comments and questions. Until next time, thanks for watching.